Thank you very much, Juan Angel, for your intervention. Now it's time of the last conference from the morning session by Amanda de la Garza. She's a Deputy Artistic Director of the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte, Reina, Sofía. She's also the General Director of Visual Arts and the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo from the University of Mexico since 2020. She was also a deputy curator at this museum from 2012 till 2019. She has been trained in curatorial studies, art history, anthropology, and sociology. She has curated and coordinated more than 30 exhibitions of modern and contemporary art, as well as archive shows and reviews of renowned artists, including Harun Faroki, Ito Steyern, Vicente Rojo, and many others, for museums in Mexico and abroad. She was co-curator of the 17th Biennale of Photography at the Center of the Image and Lectures of a Fractured Territory. That was the first review of contemporary art collection of the Museo Amparo in Puebla. She has published numerous essays, interviews, and reviews in catalogs, books, and specialized magazines. She was the member of the board of directors of ICOM Mexico from 2021 till 2024. She's currently a member of the Association of Art Museum Directors and is a member of the board of directors of the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Modern Art. Thank you, Amanda, for being here with us today. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I think it is a very necessary debate. Well, I don't have any images to show you because I focused on thinking about a series of questions that I thought were essential when it comes to debating and reflecting, and urgency in some sense. On the one hand, I have to make some kind of disclaimer that I got to Spain. I started living here 4 months ago. I used to live in Mexico as the director of University Museum of Contemporary Art in Mexico, and then I'm in a moment of an observation of the context of receiving knowledge, and that is why instead of talking about what are the future projects, what the Reina Sofía is doing in this sense, I think about a series of questions that I think are relevant nowadays in the debate that we're having. On the one hand, I would like to Juan Angel was already talking about that, and it's the impossibility of having a generalist notion on the decolonization of museums. So he was thinking about it in a division between heritage and current museums. However, contemporary art museums are or work with artists that are alive and ongoing collections. So it is a very important characteristic, and they have played a very different social role than in comparison to other museums when it comes to historical knowledge. The first difference that for me is key, and it also points us towards the debate of the definition of museum that we have seen in the ICOM, and that, well, we try to establish a consensus. I think, if I'm allowed to say it, that does not go hand in hand with the times that we live in. And in that sense, contemporary art museums are starting from the curational and commissarial kind of view of museums and not from the traditional point of view. And for me, that's important in the sense that the commissarial practice starts in historical terms as a practice that does not start from institutions. So it's something that arrives in institutions and starts taking into account non-discipline studies that includes psychoanalysis or critical theory, and that has generated, together with the practices of contemporary art, that a big part of the critical debate has been translated towards the contemporary art museums with its big limits, with Eurocentric views, colonial views that reproduce structures. But while these contemporary art practices were institutionalized, we adopted the conventions from museums in a traditional way, let's say. But I think it's worth thinking about what we talk about when we talk about contemporary art museums. And I think it's quite an important distinguishment, the distinction that other colleagues were talking about before when talking with existing collections, heritage collections, loot collections, and very often also from visions that were not valid right now. So I wanted to give that initial note, and I wanted to make sure that one of the most important processes is the acknowledgement of the political agency of museums. I think that's essential, and I think everyone was talking about this from the acknowledgement of diversity and educational initiatives, and also understanding what's the role when it comes to exercising one voice and being one platform for visibility and having a space in the public sphere. And the case is such that what happens in many museums is something that creates very much polarized debates in the public debate, let's say, that is subject to a critical movement and demands of collective and social movements. We have such a movement that with that much difficulty and polarization that it is also hard to push a critical debate, not only in the sense of giving power to the audience, because it's the new idea of critical museology, but then I ask, what does the public actually want? What does the audience want? Us in the Reina Sofia, we are a museum in which we receive a very high percentage of tourists. I'm not quite sure what the audience wants. So, do they want to see blockbusters? Do they want to see contemplative traditional art? What do we say when we say about the voice from the audience? Is it hard for them to see an exhibition just like the one from colonial memory? I think there are some terms that we need to take into account and review and understand what are the consequences of that language and the words that we use. Because we use, without difference, the notion of what's Eurocentric and colonial or post colonial. There's so many terminologies that are there that we use as if it meant the same thing. So, in the case of a museum, just like the Reina Sofia, what are the challenges that we are facing? On the one hand, of course, in this collection, in training, of course, in other contexts than the one Juan Angel was mentioning, just like the symposium of the exhibition of colonial memory, in which my colleague Suzette Sanchez, who is here, she's a curator of the Service of Latin American Art, and she presented in a very logic way a review on this part of the collection of this Latin American art from the Reina Sofia, and also a critical review and the relevant questions about what that means. I wanted to say that for the first time, the Reina Sofia has in the collections area a service of Latin American art, facing other services that belong to the arts, sculpture, installation, and other practices and videos, etc. But it's the only service inside the whole general structure of the museum that talks, let's say, about the artistic practices that are happening in a specific region. And that, up to some sense, we could have a critical debate without a geographical and not geopolitical category, and that establishes a critical debate on what happens in a specific artistic context. What are the places that we would like to go in that sense? And that we feel that it's not only the Reina Sofia, but many other museums, and in that way, collective memory here still has a lot of work to do that has to do with the past and the present relationship that we have with the Middle East, the relationship with the Philippines, of course, the relationship with Latin America, and that's not only from the acknowledgement of colonial barbaric actions, that means violence, but also from the resistance, in this case from Afro descendants, Afro or indigenous people, and on the other hand, from the acknowledgement of the influence that the whole colonization process had in cultural terms in Spain. It means that there are researchers, as you know, where something that is considered that is identitary Spanish had a huge influence, let's say, of indigenous cultures, traditions, dances, outfits, and but that relationship is not even studied or acknowledged. I'm not even going to say in the academic field, but also in a social space that is broader. In that sense, let's say that another aspect that is important is also the acknowledgement of how to establish cross-sectional and horizontal relationships among institutions of art museums, in this case of contemporary art museums, between Spain, for example, talking about the Reina Sofía, and institutions from other contexts from the global south. That implicates, let's say, an acknowledge of historical asymmetries between these institutions. Another aspect that seems very relevant to me is acknowledging, at least when it comes to equality, of the production of knowledge from other contexts, just like, for example, Global South or countries from the Global South, when it comes to establishing projects for reflection, for shared thinking. In that sense, from my perspective and in my experience that I can tell you about from the University Museum of Contemporary Art, before collecting contemporary, indigenous contemporary art, for about 4 years, we started creating a very extensive public program that had no goal. It was a program that was not made to build a collection, but to understand from where we should be collecting indigenous contemporary art and from which categories and with which agents we should be talking to. That allows to establish that, let's say, automation of reabsorption and let's say this boom that we have right now in contemporary art when it comes to, let's say, fagotization of contemporary indigenous art practices. And in this sense, I think it is very important to explore, at least in the case of collections, other property models. For example, in museums such as Norway or Australia, or recently with the Edgar Galen's works from the Cachiquel village in Guatemala, there have been museums that have talked about the matter of custody instead of property, or co-property or temporary custody, which allows to establish other kinds of relationships and rethink other kind of structures that are different from the ones that we know. So something that is very important that I said is the importance of working with institutions in other regions, not only European or North American, but mostly in Latin America or Africa or Asia, that allow to establish a critical dialogue, because this kind of debates also happen in the global south. So in different ways, there are very important examples of participation of communities that are original from the Americas, from Mexico, from Brazil, Canada, that allow to have a broader perspective and a much more open perspective until how other decolonization projects are established. I think it's a moment in which we're establishing some kind of requirements of having artists that belong to, let's say, that kind of otherhood, or otherness, sorry, or establishing another debate on categories in which those debates that is interpreted from Occidental museums. That essentialization is the is rooting that otherness that shows some kind of lost paradise on the apocalypse of the Occident of the Western world and contemporary capitalism, and it does not allow to create a critical debate that allows other categories to exist to understand the collective creation and individual creation, the notion of being united, of being the singleness, and that has been established in art history, and the aesthetic canons have established not only in the art history field, but they also build in ideological and social terms many more definitions and a different view on the world. On the other hand, one of the main debates nowadays has to do with the problem on representation, with the representation of what is known as the non-hegemonical groups, Afro-descendant communities and diaspora and migrants, indigenous communities, colonial or post-colonial, and there's a demand and the request that museums have a lot of difficulty in applying and understanding the way through which we can actually achieve that representation, that it's only in numbers or in quotas. Let's say, for example, now we will make exhibitions of women artists, and it only matters to make women artists exhibitions, but also what is being said in those exhibitions and from what critical perspective is that done? Is that from feminism or from, let's say, a decolonial position? How are those read from the museum, not in an isolated way, but also from the acknowledgement of many other agents that work in the construction of that possibility of thought of that tissue? And in that sense, there's a lot to do about quotas for representation, but I think it's an insufficient principle because there's a very big disparity on the one hand to establish where in some places we don't even have the idea of pieces of art or works of art that should belong to non-hegemonical groups in museum collections. We even wonder whether there is a positive discrimination if a year in a museum we have more exhibitions by women that is being considered wrong, and there is a debate in the media. There's a very hot debate in the media. We have all lived this in social media in the museums. There's an atrocious debate that is right now something that has to do with the social polarization. And in this sense, I believe it is very important to think about how we're moving forward, not only on this problem of representation, but what we have already said in other contexts, also on the inclusion um, of racialized people, not only for the quotas, but also for institutions and social regulations that stop those people to access some positions and leading positions. And of course, I don't want to talk about me, but I think it also has a significance, the fact that a Mexican brown woman from middle class is the first Mexican brown woman that is in a leading position in Spain in a national museum. But it is the same situation that happened in Mexico. I was the only lead of an important contemporary art museum that is brown and from middle class in Mexico. So what happens here also happens in other contexts, but also from, let's say, a different regulation or other kind of structures that also come from colonial structures and from that internal colonialism. And in this sense, it is important to have that acknowledgement of the capacity that museums have when it comes to talking about a social agency in the Reina Sofía that has been on the vanguard at this reflection with all the institutional limitations that there could have been in all the possible tasks that are still pending. But one of the projects that, at least from my point of view, has tried to think about this debate in other terms, in the terms of what is the function of the museum in this critical debate, is without a doubt the project of located museum, which is an assembly that works as an assembly between the museum, that is made up by the museum and by collectives from different characteristics, collectives for women, for um, women working in their homes, collectives working with migrant children, and there is an exploration of other ways to have this debate with different communities that are previously organized with clear demands that need to establish, if not a horizontality, at least other position for the museum. At least the museum has a privileged position, but it establishes a conversation with these collectives. And we have a series of activities. Now they're doing events and they're using the museum as a space of social encounter, of debate. But we are doing, for example, the neighborhood picnic that is done every year, and it is an open invitation to all the neighbors in Lavapiés. But on the other hand, it also allows the museum to understand the possibility of a new institutionality. In this sense, I think the initiative or the initiatives that are related with the possibilities of decolonization, they have to do with how to think about new institutionalities. So Elvira Espejo, for example, whom I have heard and talk in at other times, and all the work that she has done to build a different kind of institutionality, is one of the most, let's say, rounded up examples, but they go hand in hand with other very interesting examples, like the new museum of the Sami people that it's in Karasjok in Norway, where we're debating, and it's the Sami parliament, the one that is the ones that are building, at least from scratch, a new museum in which we are critically debating and where we can't see this distinction between, for example, arts and craftsmanship. In other examples of museums in Brazil, latitudes that allows to separate these kinds of categories that are part of the Western canon and colonial canon with regards to art, and in this sense, how can we learn from these other experiences? That means not seeing them as an isolated example, but also learning from other institutionalities that are starting from collective social and regional contexts. Mainly, if we understand that decoloniality or decolonization is a social and political movement. I think it's very important to be understood. Everything we do is questions and attempts to call out different situations and to transform the place that we're talking to, from which we're talking. And of course, there's a whole series of heritage museums of reflections on restitution, on repairs, and many other practical and political problems and complexities that are.
However, in these debates, us, the workers of the museums, were very afraid of getting wrong in terms of language, political correction, and also about the public sensitivity. and also about the difference in terms of power, like other people today have mentioned, because the idea of museum, the current idea of museum is just an Olympia of the art. So that's why we live in fear, and we are very cautious about what we do. And I have a lot of colleagues that work in museums in Europe and in North America, and we all live with guilt. And I want to define this in this way with this word because, according to my perspective, we are really afraid because we don't know how to handle this very difficult situation. And with these new structures of debate and this new structure of our museums and of our place, but the political correction, the guilt and fear are not enough to transform institutions. Nobody is innocent. But if we can think about these questions with our teams, how can we act in an ethical framework with institution, with artists, and with us? In that case, we're going to have a solution and a new horizon. Thank you so much.